It was one of the worst arguments of our marriage. Years ago, Melville and I were in Tucson, Arizona. It was the morning of our last day on vacation. We were trying to get ready and go out for the day, and I picked a fight over something meaningless. Brushing teeth sticks in my mind for some reason. Even as I got louder and angrier, I knew I was being completely ridiculous, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. Only at the end of a day of hardly speaking to each other could I admit to myself what was really going on. The night before, we had driven out to Kitt Peak National Observatory for their late-night program. As we were heading back to Tucson well after midnight, we ran into a Border Patrol checkpoint. Melville was driving the rental car. He slowed down as we approached the checkpoint. The first officer we came to was looking away, talking to a colleague, and not giving any indication that we had to stop. So Melville didn't. He drove through. About 5 officers jumped at the car, screaming and waving their hands. Melville slammed on the brakes so hard the back seat fell down. Then the officers asked for our IDs and spent several minutes searching our car. I was afraid. When you are married to an immigrant, even a legal immigrant with a green card who's white and a native speaker of English, every interaction with the Border Patrol is a little bit terrifying. And it looked like Melville was trying to run from them. I was certain he was going to be arrested, and how was I going to find a lawyer at 1 a.m. in the middle of nowhere, Arizona? It ended up being fine. Melville did not get arrested. The officers let us go, and we got safely back to our hotel. But I was afraid. And the next day, I was arguing with him because I was afraid. For the disciples, the last few days have been the highest of highs mixed with foreboding and confusion. Jesus has taken them to the far north near Caesarea Philippi, where he's asked them who they say that he is. Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." The disciples were overcome with wonder and awe, being with Jesus as Peter names what they've all realized about him. But then the moment turned, and Jesus was telling them that he will be rejected and killed, and after 3 days rise again. He went on, "Any who want to follow him have to take up their cross and lose their lives for his sake." The disciples were shocked. How can this be real? Jesus is the Messiah. How can he die? How can we die for following him? A few days later, Jesus took Peter and James and John up a high mountain, and he was transfigured before them. They saw the Messiah, the Son of God, in all his glory. It's more transcendent even than Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi. It's the closest these disciples have ever been to God. Meanwhile, the other disciples have been trying and failing to heal a boy with epilepsy. When Jesus came down the mountain, maybe still glowing from his transfiguration, he healed the boy easily. Wonderful for the child and his parents, but embarrassing for the disciples who'd failed. Now, as they all walk back home to Capernaum, Jesus is again talking about his death, that he will be betrayed into human hands, and those hands will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise again. The disciples don't understand. Jesus is the Messiah. How can he die? The Son of God isn't supposed to die. And they are afraid. So afraid of what Jesus is telling them that they don't even ask him to explain. They're so afraid that they start a huge, ridiculous argument. If you are like me, and you know a thing or two about picking fights over something meaningless, you might imagine how it happens. Thaddeus has got really quiet. He's withdrawn into himself. And he hears Philip humming, the way Philip always does when Thaddeus is trying to concentrate. Thaddeus mutters to Philip, For the love of God, will you stop that humming? You are so annoying. And Philip mutters back, oh, you think I'm annoying? You and your stomping. You must have stomped all over Galilee 100 times by now. Bartholomew snaps at them both. You two are the worst. Why does Jesus put up with you? I sure wouldn't if I were him. And Thomas butts in, geez, Barty, it's not like you're so awesome. When Jesus is on his throne in glory and we're all lined up behind him, you're going to be at the end of the line. On and on it goes, their voices rising until they're shouting at each other. And Jesus, leading the way, can hear every word. It doesn't take any special Jesus power to know what the argument is about. Everyone on the Capernaum road has heard it. When they reach the house where they're staying in town, Jesus is deliberately casual. Sounded like a pretty heated argument back there. What was it about? The disciples are ashamed to admit it was about who was the greatest, so they don't answer. They all sit down to rest their feet, and Jesus says, I'll be right back. He pokes his head out the front door where the neighbor kids are playing in the street. He spots the one he knows best and asks the child to come inside for a moment. He scoops up the kid, carries them into the living room, and says to his friends, whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me. In its own way, this teaching is almost as difficult as the one about taking up one's cross. To welcome a child is to open your heart to that child, to love that child. And in their time, loving a child means the possibility of losing that child. Until a couple hundred years ago, half of all children died before they were 5. Every one of the disciples has lost brothers, sisters, cousins, playmates. Every one of them has been to funerals with tiny bodies and shrouds and heard parents weeping in agony. The disciples know that to love a child is to be constantly afraid of losing them. It seems that following Jesus doesn't bring any respite, because now they're afraid of losing Jesus too. Jesus is asking the disciples to accept their fear, even embrace it, not to displace it by arguing, not to preempt it by closing off their hearts, but to sit with it. Let themselves feel afraid. And then the disciples can notice what happens. If they do, they'll recognize that their fear is separating them from Jesus. They don't understand what he's teaching them. They're afraid to ask him, and he's right there with them. They haven't lost him. He's still there. Love always entails the possibility of loss. That's the risk we take when we welcome anyone into our hearts, a child, a lover, a friend, Jesus. But we lose so much more when our fear turns into arguments and leads us to ignore the beloved one who's walking the road with us. We live in argumentative times, dear ones, where our public life is dominated by polarization and conflict. I wonder whether all this arguing is really because we're afraid of our warming climate and unchecked gun violence and loss of social and economic status, all the things that keep us up at night. And we don't like being afraid. I wonder what might happen if, instead of separating ourselves from each other with fighting, what if we sat with our fear and let ourselves feel afraid? What would we notice? Where would we see Jesus? How would he transform our fear into connection with him and with those around us? At the end of a long day of sniping at each other in Tucson, I finally said to Melville, I was really scared at that Border Patrol checkpoint last night. That's the real reason I've been fighting, because I was afraid something would happen to you." He nodded and hugged me and said, "Nothing did happen. I'm still here." He was right. He usually is. And if I had just said I was really afraid, we wouldn't have argued with each other on the way. Instead, we would have found that Jesus was with us, still there with us, walking with us along the road.